Welcome to the Explainer. So, I want you to think about the human pelvis for a second. It's not just some static biological container, right? It is an absolute structural marvel. Seriously, think of it like a magnificent suspension bridge, or maybe the vaulted ceiling of a grand cathedral. The pelvic organs literally require absolute perfection in their suspension system to avoid completely collapsing. And when that suspension fails, well, the results are pretty drastic. Today, we're diving into a really fascinating paper by Halen and Vu from Neurourology and Urodynamics. They detail the specific surgical anatomy of the uppermost part of the vagina. We're going to break down exactly how this structure is supported, why it fails, and how modern surgeons are going in and literally rebuilding the foundation. Let's get into it.
Here's our quick roadmap for today. We're going to look at the pelvic prolapse problem, define what the vaginal vault actually is, check out the pre-hysterectomy ligament support, look at post-hysterectomy vulnerability, and finally, wrap up with improving surgical repairs.
All right, let's start with part one, the pelvic prolapse problem.
So I want to pose a bit of a medical mystery to you right out of the gate. When a patient comes in with a bulge in the lower vaginal wall, something like a rectocele or a cystocele, the natural instinct is to look right at the immediate area of the bulge. Makes sense, right? But what if the floor isn't actually the problem? What if the ceiling is caving in? We have to ask, why do over half of all rectoceles actually involve a failure at the very top of the vagina? It totally forces us to rethink our assumptions about where these pelvic floor issues actually start.
Just think about this staggering statistic for a second. Roughly 45% of cystoceles, which is when the bladder drops, and a massive 55% of rectoceles are directly caused by a prolapse of the vaginal vault. Yeah, you heard that right. And about half of these cases, that lower structural bulging you see, it's just a secondary symptom. The actual primary failure is happening way up at the top, at the apex of the system, and it's basically dragging everything else down with it.
Moving to part two, defining the vaginal vault. Okay, so in surgical terms, the vaginal vault is known as the level 1 section of the vagina. And by definition, it's measured posteriorly, starting right from the highest part of the vagina, the apex, and extending exactly 2.5 centimeters below that point. And what's really beautiful about this specific anatomy is that it comprises 4 distinct arches, or fornices. You have the anterior, the posterior, and 2 lateral fornices. Calling it a vault is honestly so appropriate here. These 4 arch spaces look just like the vaulted ceiling of a classical building, totally designed to distribute weight and hold that space open. Now, check out how surgeons actually visualize this crucial levelized zone. You can see the measurement from the hymen all the way up, but I really want you to focus on that highlighted section at the very top. It is exactly 2.5 centimeters. This is the precise anatomical zone we're talking about today. If this 2.5 centimeter ceiling loses its structural integrity, while all those level 2 and level 3 structures sitting right below it, they are suddenly put under an immense, completely unnatural amount of pressure.
Let's move on to part 3, pre-hysterectomy ligament support.
In a healthy pre-hysterectomy anatomy, the vault isn't just floating there by magic. It is heavily suspended by biological cables. The uterosacral ligaments, or USL, pull upwards and backward toward the sacrum. Then you've got the cardinal ligaments, or CL, pulling backward and to the sides. But here is the absolute architectural genius of the human body. As these ligaments reach the cervix and upper vagina, their distal segments actually fuse together. They combine into this incredibly robust 2 to 3 centimeter structure called the cardinal uterosacral complex, or CUSC. This fused complex acts as the ultimate heavy-duty anchor for the whole upper vaginal architecture.
You can really see those distinct vectors pulling back and up here. The USL is extending way back towards the bony sacrum, while the broader CL kind of fans out laterally. And right there at the point where they meet those upper structures, you've got the CUSC, that fused anchor point. It's essentially a dynamic tension system. These ligaments are constantly pulling, creating this taut, supportive hammock that stops gravity and intra-abdominal pressure from just pushing all those organs down and out.
And transitioning from the textbook theory to reality, this cadaveric view really grounds us spatially. It shows just how thick and vital these physical cables actually are. I mean, we aren't just talking about thin, flimsy little tissues here. Look at how that complex is being lifted. You can clearly see the cardinal ligament and the uterosacral ligament merging into that thick, white, fibrous band. That is the CUSC. It's heavy-duty anatomical rigging, totally designed to withstand decades of physical stress, lifting, and just the daily grind of gravity.
Which brings us to part 4, post-hysterectomy vulnerability. So let's contrast that robust original anatomy we just looked at with the compromised state after surgery. Before a hysterectomy, the posterior fornix, that back arch of the vault, is completely suspended. But during a hysterectomy, the cervix is removed, and those main primary ligament complexes, they get severed, and they're often reattached to the top of the vaginal cuff to close the gap. And this brings us to the massive problem the source authors highlight. While the anterior part of the new cuff manages to retain some residual ligament support, the posterior fornix is left with absolutely zero direct ligamentous support. The back half of the ceiling is just suddenly left totally unanchored.
And as you might guess, that sudden lack of structural support directly invites a massive collapse. On one hand, you might have a relatively normal post-hysterectomy cuff, but on the other, because that posterior area has completely lost its suspension cables, the vault simply caves in on itself under pressure. It forms a massive cystointerseal. The bladder, the bowels, literally everything above it just takes advantage of that weakened, unanchored vault and pushes downward. This isn't just a slight sagging, folks. It is a profound structural inversion of the anatomy.
Finally, Part 5, Improving Surgical Repairs.
To actually fix this problem, a surgeon has to first figure out exactly how far the ceiling has fallen. They calculate this metric called the Posterior Vaginal Vault Descent, or PVVD. It's this brilliant, super precise mathematical step they do right there in the operating room. First, they measure the total length of the posterior vagina from the top apex all the way down to the perineum. Then they grab the vault apex with forceps, apply some traction to see how loose it is, and measure that distance to the perineum. Finally, they just subtract the second value from the first. Boom. That gives them the exact descent defect, a really precise measurement of just how bad the vault collapse actually is.
And you've got to remember this key threshold from our source material. A calculated PVV defect of 5 centimeters or more, that is the clinical line in the sand. If the vault can descend 5 centimeters or more, it tells the surgeon there is an absolute clinical need for dedicated vaginal vault surgical support. You can't just slap a patch on the lower walls. You have to fix the roof. Surgeons will usually jump to advanced techniques, like a sacrospinous colpopexy, to physically pin that apex back up to the strong ligaments of the pelvis and restore that lost levelized suspension.
So here is how this translates into a real-world surgical fix. Skilled surgeons can actually go in and salvage what's left of the original suspension cables. Now, while the cardinal ligaments aren't really available post-hysterectomy, the intermediate segment of the uterosacral ligament often stays intact, sitting right above the vaginal cuff scar. By putting that area under a bit of tension, surgeons can locate this thick, residual band of the USL, grab it, and use sutures to placate it. Basically, they fold it and tighten it to rebuild that lost suspension and recreate the vault's apex. Honestly, it's an absolute masterclass in using the body's leftover architecture to rebuild structural integrity.
I want to wrap up this explainer with a really powerful thesis directly from our source authors, Halen and Vu. They state, effective management of vaginal vault prolapse will need to be part of most pelvic organ prolapse repairs. This fundamentally shifts how we need to view pelvic anatomy, right? I mean, if up to 55% of rectoceles are driven by a collapsing vault, we have to ask ourselves, how many standard pelvic repairs fail simply because they treat the bulging floor, while completely ignoring the collapsed ceiling? Understanding the precise surgical anatomy of this 2.5 centimeter vault isn't just an academic exercise. It is quite literally the key to permanently restoring the architectural integrity of the human body. So what do you think? Are we focusing too much on the floor and not enough on the ceiling? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and as always, keep questioning the foundations of what you know.